So here's the devotional. If for those of you who haven't seen it, you can get hard copies. I think there's still hard copies available here at the Welcome Center, or you can get an email entered to your email box every day. John, I'm going to kind of pass it over to you to talk about what your solicit observations.
Okay. All these wires around. Okay, so number of you have been reading into the book as we go along with the devotions. Has anybody read the whole book? Okay, good. What are your impressions, thoughts, concerns about the book?
I mean, I really stalled out in the lost period. Like there's so much excitement in Exodus. There's a lot that happens. And then you get to the law parts around chapter 20, and I really get, like, it's so bogged down in how specific and instructional it is. Like, I didn't know if I dug a hole and a donkey fell into it, I'd be responsible. Some of those things and so that part, I always get really stalled out and have to think a lot about how does that part apply to me now.
Yeah, so Michael's observation was, again, for those over the first part's all this action there. Plagues and Red Sea, all this sort of stuff, and man, a lot of action. And then you get to the tabernacle part, which I unhappily picked as part of my devotional. I thought, what in the world am I going to pull out of this? This is boring stuff. And yet it's interesting to know that for the ancients, it probably worked the other way. What they wanted to get to was the tabernacle, because this sets up their religion, and this is fascinating to them. And to us, it's, oh my goodness, they made this of acacia wood and that of this, and so many yards of cloth for this. Okay. So, but that's just a different perspective, yes, but very good, yeah. And other thoughts? How many are very pleased to have a God who hardens Pharaoh's heart so that he can inflict more plagues on the poor Egyptian people? Not me. Yeah, okay. Does that bother anybody? It's okay. Well, anyway, so we'll just see what we're going to do, and we'll try to answer what these questions are. We'll turn it back to Melissa here, as long as...
All right, getting used to a clicker. This is high tech. Wrong way. All right, so we're going to kick this off. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about the whole book. So the way we're going to kind of cover this is talking about the structure of the book of Exodus, because there's a lot going on in there, but it is broken out into kind of 3 main movements. We're going to go over the storyline and the journey that the Israelites go on. And then what we're going to pop in here are some of the parallels with Genesis. So I've shared with most of you who have listened to me that I am a big fan of a group called the Bible Project. Yes, thank you, Sarah Day, for mouthing that along with me. Yes. And so they actually have a fascinating 12-series podcast on Exodus that I plowed through in November and December. And they cover a lot of kind of the historical parallels and all the connection points and what they call hyperlinks to other parts of the Bible. So anyways, I wanted to pull some of those out and at least share some of the things that I learned there. So we're going to talk about those parallels to Genesis. And then also just give you a couple of questions to think about in parallels of Exodus to your current lives. So that's what we're going to do. Structure, storyline, parallels to Genesis, and parallels to your own life. So let's get started. All right, 3 movements. Today, we are going to cover the first one. So intentionally, the first movement actually covers Exodus 1 through 15. This is really about Israel in slavery, Moses being raised up, and then what John spoke to, the 10 plagues, and then Passover. So that's kind of what we're covering today. Coincidentally, not really, this also means that as of today, you should be around Exodus 7 in the devotional, and so by next week, you should be around 14 or 15. So look at that. Okay, so we're going to try to cover the material leading up through next week's readings, And then in next week, we will cover the balance of the book, which should be a precursor for you prior to heading into the rest of the devotional. Intentional, okay? Okay, we are going to watch a 6-minute video, because of course I can't do a presentation without doing something for the Bible Project. The book of Exodus has 2 videos. We're only going to watch one today, which coincides really closely with the first movement. Gee, I wonder why. And then next week we'll watch the other one. This is going to be a little bit clunky because I have to flip between screens. So talk amongst yourself while I do that. And in about a minute, we'll be watching the video on the overview of the first half of Exodus. John, you want to just randomly ask questions?
Oh, okay, yeah. While she's doing the, okay, I'm a computer science prof, but I do theory, she does practice. So while she's doing that, any thoughts or questions you have? Yeah, if you have questions, I'll talk a little bit about the historical situation where it was written as they
I'm
best
actually
they
here.
could get.
I'm actually here.
You're ready?
I'm
Let's go.
there sooner than I thought.
Book of Exodus. It's the second book of the Bible, and it picks up the storyline from the previous book of Genesis, which ended with Abraham's grandson, Jacob, leading his large family of 70 people down to Egypt. Now, Jacob's 11th son, Joseph, had been elevated to second in command over Egypt, and he had saved his whole family. And so Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, offered the family to come live there as a safe haven. And so eventually Jacob dies there in Egypt, and Joseph and all his brothers do too. About 400 years pass, and the story of the Exodus begins. Now that name refers to the event that takes place in the first half of the book, Israel's Exodus from Egypt. But the book has a second half that takes place at the foot of Mount Sinai. In this video, we'll just focus on the first half, where centuries have passed, and the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied, and they filled the land. Now, this line is a deliberate echo back to the blessing that God gave all humanity back in the Garden of Eden. And it reminds us of the big biblical story so far. Humanity forfeited God's blessing through sin and rebellion, and so God chose Abraham's family as the vehicle through which he would restore his blessing to all the world. But the new Pharaoh does not view Israel as a blessing. He actually thinks this growing Israelite immigrant group is a threat to his power. And so just as in Genesis, humanity rebels against God's blessing, so here, Pharaoh attempts to destroy the source of God's blessing, the Israelites. He brutally enslaves them in forced labor, and then he orders that all the Israelite boys be drowned in the Nile River. Now Pharaoh, he is the worst character in the Bible so far. His kingdom epitomizes humanity's rebellion against God. Pharaoh has so redefined good and evil according to his own interests that even the murder of innocent children has become good to him. And so Egypt has become worse than Babylon from the book of Genesis. And so now Israel cries out for help against this new Babylon, and God responds. God first turns Pharaoh's evil upside down as an Israelite mother throws her boy into the Nile River, but in a basket. And so he floats safely right down into Pharaoh's own family. He's named Moses, and he grows up to eventually become the man that God will use to defeat Pharaoh. In the famous story of the burning bush, God appears to Moses and commissions him to go to Pharaoh and order him to release the Israelites. And God says that he knows Pharaoh will resist, and so he will bring his judgment on Egypt in the form of plagues. Then God also says that he will harden Pharaoh's heart. And so we're introduced into the next main part of the story, the confrontation between God and Pharaoh. Now, what does this mean that God says he'll harden Pharaoh's heart? It's super important to read this section of the story really closely and in sequence. In Moses and Pharaoh's first encounter, we're told simply that Pharaoh's heart grew hard. There's no implication God did anything. And so in response, God sends the first set of 5 plagues, each one confronting Pharaoh and one of his Egyptian gods. And each time, Moses offers a chance for Pharaoh to humble himself and to let the Israelites go. But after each plague, we're told that Pharaoh either hardened his heart or that his heart grew hard. He's doing this of his own will. And so eventually, it's with the second set of 5 plagues that we begin to hear how God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So the point of the story seems to be, even though God knew that Pharaoh would resist his will, God still offered him all these chances to do the right thing. But eventually, Pharaoh's evil reaches a point of no return. I mean, even his own advisors think that he has lost his mind. And it's at that point that God takes over and bends Pharaoh's evil towards his own redemptive purposes. God lures Pharaoh into his own destruction as he saves his people, which is what happens next. With the final plague, it's the night of Passover, and God turns the tables on Pharaoh. Just as he killed the sons of the Israelites, so God will kill the firstborn in Egypt with the final plague. But unlike Pharaoh, God provides a means of escape through the blood of the Lamb. And here the story stops and introduces us in detail to the annual Israelite ritual of Passover. On the night before Israel left Egypt, they sacrificed a young spotless lamb and painted the blood of the doorframe of their house. And when the divine plague came over Egypt, the houses covered with the blood of the lamb were passed over on the son of Pharaoh. And so every year since, the Israelites have reenacted that night to remember and to celebrate God's justice and his mercy. But Pharaoh, because of his pride and rebellion, he loses his own son. And he's compelled to finally let the Israelites go free. And so the Israelite slaves make their exodus from Egypt. But no sooner do they leave that Pharaoh changes his mind. And he gathers his army and chases after the Israelites for a final showdown. As the Israelites pass through the waters of the sea safely, Pharaoh charges towards his own destruction. The Exodus story concludes with the first song of praise in the Bible. It's called the Song of the Sea. And the final line declares that the Lord reigns as king. And then the song retells in poetry what the story of God's kingdom is all about. It's about how God is on a mission to confront evil in his world and to redeem those who are enslaved to evil. God is going to bring his people into the promised land where his divine presence will live among them. This story is what it looks like when God becomes king over his people. So after the Israelites sing their song, the story takes a sharp turn. The Israelites are trekking through the wilderness on their way to Mount Sinai, and they're hungry, they're thirsty, and they start criticizing Moses and God for even rescuing them. They say they long for the good old days, and food is crazy. So God graciously provides food and water for Israel in the wilderness, but these stories, they cast a dark shadow. And we begin to wonder, could it be that Israel's heart is just as hard as Pharaoh's? We shall see. But for now, that's the first half of the book of Exodus.
It'll take me a minute. Can you ask about questions?
Okay. Questions, having seen that? Get it back. Yeah, so, yes.
I like the explanation of Pharaoh hardened his heart versus Pharaoh's hardened versus God hardened his heart. Because that was kind of the same.
The business about Pharaoh hardening his heart and then God hardening Pharaoh's heart. That's worth noting, yes. But again, it's the average guy in Egypt takes the brunt of it, right? So, yeah.
Anything else?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that sort of stood out to me from reading, but also from here, is that Moses is like this. He's like a glacier, you know. He's moving slowly and really sort of nothing. God's pushing him, and nothing's going to stand in his way. But he's very unidirectional in what he's doing, as opposed to Pharaoh, who was honestly very capricious. You know, like he says, "All right, go," and then he changes his mind again. You know, so it was very interesting to me to see
Yeah.
like those two different demeanors that I think was sort of brought out.
Well, and I like the glacier comment. I would say he's also a reluctant glacier.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and Pharaoh was certainly, went back on his word a good solid 9 times
Right.
until the very end.
And Moses, when he demurred, he did it directly with God.
Yes.
In conversation with God, not acting out towards other people. So that was
Repeat it
also-
for the people.
Oh, sorry. Charlie?
Yeah, for what it's worth, I've watched several of the Bible Project videos. I think they're great. I've been to seminary here a little bit, and I find they go kind of fast.
Yep.
So if you're feeling like you got fire hose with information, and you can go back and look at it again, you're not alone. So just 2 cents there.
Yep.
And I'm not sure I've said this publicly yet in terms of our reading of Exodus, and I think it's important for us to frame it this way. The Exodus story is the foundational narrative for what is often called liberation theology. And that's been utilized or reflected on by black people, women, Latin America, as people who have faced situations of oppression that, dare I say, most of us, or I'll say me, that I haven't experienced directly. So one of the challenges for us, for me, I'll speak first person and you can plug in where you like. For me, as someone who doesn't really know social, gender, racial, any form of oppression, but to hear this through the ears of people who are struggling to survive and have been exploited and suffered for all sorts of things. This is the story of God rescuing the people, bringing hope to people who were enslaved. So it's really a radical text, sometimes been called the Easter event of the Old Testament. So just try to keep that in mind as you read. Sorry.
It's okay.
I get excited about this stuff.
It's great. Hey, Peg.
I have a lot of trouble separating what I'm reading from Charlton Heston. Absolutely terrified as a 7-year-old
Yeah.
to see that rod turn into a snake and waters open up. So
Yeah.
it's interesting for me to look at it through
Yeah.
your eyes.
Yeah. Well, let's start to walk through the first movement then, so we can get into a little bit more detail. And like I said before, first movement, this is basically what we're going to be covering today. So we've got Israel and slavery. Can you not hear? Is that better? Better? Okay.
Yeah, let's get more in front of you.
I think I just need to be like that.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'm just gonna be all in the mic. So we'll need a Purell swipe of this afterwards. Okay, so first movement, we're gonna cover Israel and slavery, Moses being raised up, the 10 plagues, and a nod to Passover. So I tried to put together some charts because this is, there's a lot of material here. So I know on slides, less words is more, but I was incapable of getting it less than this, so I apologize in advance. But just in terms of the first section of the first movement, we're going to cover Israel and slavery. And I try to boil it down to what I see as like the key points here. So what's the problem? The problem is the Israelites are in Egypt. They are becoming fruitful and multiplying. And as a result, they are a threat to Pharaoh's power because they are basically, becoming the majority. So what happens? The Israelites are enslaved. What's the solution that Pharaoh comes up with? Well, let's just drown all the baby boys because that should keep it from, continuing to grow. I kind of think they picked the wrong gender there, but that was the plan. But then we get a little plot twist where an Israelite baby boy, Moses, is saved when his mother puts him in a basket and floats him down the Nile. He's found and he's raised by Pharaoh's family. So obviously Moses is our key character through this book. Here he comes floating down the river. Then we've got some time that passes. Obviously, the first couple of years, he's actually nursed by his mother. He goes back, he lives and is adopted by Pharaoh's family. He grows up a bit, and we kind of reintroduce ourselves to Moses when he is kind of out amongst the people, and he witnesses an Egyptian beating an Israelite. At this point, he's enraged, and he actually kills the Egyptian. Pharaoh finds out and then threatens to murder Moses. So now Moses got a little problem because he's living with Pharaoh. Pharaoh's trying to kill him. So he's forced into exile, and he runs away into the wilderness. Meanwhile, now Pharaoh is retaliating against all the Israelites and making their jobs even harder. And the Israelites are quite annoyed because they're like, we didn't ask you to kill this Egyptian. You've stepped in and done this, and now you've made things even worse for me. So there's a bit of tension and unrest between Moses and the Israelites. So there's a ton of parallels to Genesis here, and that's what I wanted to kind of pop in. But before I do that, are there any kind of questions on super high level overview? Okay. All right, parallels. So over here in the problem area where we've got Israelites becoming fruitful and multiplying, they said that in the video, direct pickup to what we see in Genesis. It comes up in the Garden of Eden. It comes up a ton of times, actually. It's in the very beginning of Genesis where the animals, the creatures that are created on the earth become fruitful and multiply. Adam and Eve are charged to do this. Noah's family is charged to do this. So this is a direct pickup. So for those who are growing up orally on the Bible, the fruitful and multiply type language is very familiar, which is why I put Adam and Eve plus. Then we come over here to Israelite and Moses being saved as he goes floating down the river, direct parallel to Noah's Ark there. And also a foreshadowing to the parting of the Red Sea that's going to happen later on in the book. Down with Moses killing the Egyptian, he is essentially being his brother's keeper there a little bit in terms of taking care of other Israelites that are being wronged, parallel to Cain and Abel. And then being forced into exile and running away, parallel from exile from Eden. So just some connections there. Charlie's sort of nodding, so if I go astray,
No.
okay.
I'm reading a book on Exodus right now, and it uses a musical metaphor, saying it's like a symphony. With, the way symphonies are
Yeah.
kind of work, the themes.
Things come in and yeah.
Themes come in and they come back, and the themes from Exodus just run through Scripture like a symphony. So
Yep.
This is beautiful.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Woohoo. All right. Moving on. Moses gets raised up. So over the next 40 years, so here he is out being exiled, right? He lands in Midian. And of course, I went down a slippery slope of where Midian is. So I won't go into that. But anyways, he lands in Midian. He meets his future wife at a well. He marries her. And then he works as a shepherd for his father-in-law. So this is kind of where we pick him up again. He's a shepherd. And he's out tending his flock near Mount Horeb one day. How fun is that? Had to go with the yellow highlight. So he's out tending his flock in Mount Horeb one day when he, just being a shepherd, and then comes across an kind of angelic figure at a burning bush. So a little out of the ordinary. He's freaked out, and voice says, "Take off your shoes, you're standing on holy ground." He's like, "I'm just out with my sheep," right? This is not normal. So this whole interaction happens, which is a complete game changer for him, obviously, and kind of begins the catalyst for the rest of the book. So the voice, which we know to be God, is saying, "I have heard the people crying out, and I am coming to rescue them," referring to the Israelites that are enslaved in Egypt. He says, "I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt." And I'm sure Moses is like, "I've got a hit on my head over there, so this might not be the best person." And then he says, "You will return to this place and bring your people." So Moses is a little not so on board with this request. Moses goes through a series of kind of sly trying to get out of this situation. He's saying like, "Well, who even are you?" "I'm Yahweh," this is key because this is the first time the Yahweh language comes up. And what that loosely translated to is, "I am who I am." Moses is like, "Well, they're not going to believe me that I'm going to be sent to Pharaoh to, let people go. They're not going to believe me that I'm being directed to do this." So God goes through this piece where he says, "Pick up your staff, throw it to the ground. It's going to turn into a snake. then pick it off the ground and it's going to become a staff again. So kind of showing this like miraculous change. And Moses is like, well, I don't really speak that well, so I really just don't think this is going to work out. And God's like, well, your brother Aaron's going to go with you, so enough of that. So he tries, but finally he relents and he prepares for the journey.
So,
Yeah.
how does Moses have a brother if he was floated down the river and all the boys were?
Great question. I don't know, John?
So literally.
Is he a brother-in-law?
No,
Maybe he's an older brother.
He is supposed to be an older.
Yeah.
This is all sorts of stories. Wait a minute, so again, I believe this is a constructed story, a well-constructed artistic story. And here's a little loose end on it, yeah. Yeah.
But it said in like maybe yesterday's chapter about, and so-and-so and his aunt, he took her to wife and had Moses and Aaron. Didn't that sound right?
Well-
Remembering that right?
I don't know, you may be right. But anyway, to me, now it's a great literary story, and this is a loose end in the plot. Yeah. Good, excellent question, you're very interesting.
Well, Peg, why don't you report back on that next week? That'd be great. Okay, so again, we got some serious parallels going here and also a little bit of foreshadowing. So the first is, and I honestly, until this whole like round and little podcast journey I went down, did not realize that Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai were the same thing. Okay, I'm not the only one. Great, I feel better. Oh, John, uh-oh.
They're different, sorry. I take the position that there are different traditions in Israel of which is the holy mountain.
Okay.
But, you
Directionally-
raise the problem by making them the same, but I think they were different.
Okay. TBD.
Creative story.
Creative story, exactly. Aaron's there, I guess. So foreshadowing, but when he says, you'll return to this place and bring your people, and then there are scholars that seem to allude that it is the same place. And then the parallel of, this one I had to kind of squint on, but that Pharaoh is likened to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. And then there's also language about how, I'm going to get this wrong, but God's going to return and crush the head of the Pharaoh, or crush the head of the serpent. There's a lot of language about serpents, etc., in the Bible. So there's a connection here. All right. Yes?
Well, I think in ancient Near Eastern literature, serpents were always the opposing.
Oh.
It was like, you know, the old westerns with the cowboys.
Oh.
You know?
Okay.
You see a serpent and you go, oh, that's the bad news.
Okay.
You know, so that connection to Pharaoh is, you know.
That would fit the bill.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So the comment is that in older literature, the serpent was frequently a symbol for the opposer. Would certainly fit the bill here. All right, so we're now, Moses is what, maybe 55, 60, something like that. And he's just minding his business as a, shepherd. And all of a sudden he's in this whole different situation that was not part of his life plan. So, questions to ask yourself. What is God calling you to do? Possibly not going to Pharaoh and asking to let the people go, but surely there is something that God is asking you to do that's on your heart that perhaps you're providing some excuses, just like Moses did, to try to get out of it. So, things to ponder. Deep thoughts on January 7th. Okay. Oh, wait, I had a whole bit here I was going to say in between. Hold on. Wait. Ah! Hold on. I got to get my notes back up. Okay. So continuing on with our story, after Moses relents, he and his brother start to prepare for their return trip to Egypt to convince this new Pharaoh, so Pharaoh, but it's a different one than the one who was in charge when he left. So as you can imagine, the Pharaoh is not too keen on the idea to go ahead and let all of his slave labor go, right? So this is kind of where we pick things up. So Pharaoh is told basically that his land will be inflicted by one plague after another until he allows the Israelites to leave. Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and you heard in the video they kind of toggled between his heart is hard and God hardened his heart. But regardless, he is not amenable to letting the Israelites go. So they go through a series of 10 plagues, with really 9 of them not working. Working for most people, but not Pharaoh. And then the 10th one being absolutely the kicker. So I just thought we'd go through these and talk about some of the symbolism. And a word that I was introduced to recently was decreation. And so again, when we're talking about the parallels to the Genesis story, a lot of what we're going to see here is elements that decreate things that were created in the creation story, if that makes sense. How am I doing? Okay. So the first plague is water being turned to blood. And so we've got this symbolism here of blood of the innocent Israelite boys who were drowned in the Nile River. And now you have the water turning to blood that could be also a symbol of those kids. Also, the Nile River is the primary water source in the region. So your own livelihood on it, the health of your flocks, your crops, everything are dependent on it. So hitting this source is really impactful. Then frogs is a second, frogs coming up. Frogs, this is material because frogs live in both the water and the land. And if we go back to Genesis, when God separated the water from the land, basically, this is sort of bringing those two things together again. Gnats from dust. So gnats represent death and mortality. And if we, again, go back to Genesis and think about the Garden of Eden, when God created humans out of dust, and now we have gnats coming from dust that represent mortality. And then there's a lovely series of very unpleasant plagues. We've got infestation of flies, death of all livestock, boils breaking out all over your skin, thunder and hail crushing all of your crops, and then, if that's not enough, a swarm of locusts to finish off anything that's left. So the reason I have these separated out is that these set of plagues they only impact the Egyptians. So there's an area, I believe it was called Goshen, where the Israelites are living, and that area is not impacted by any of these plagues. So the other part that was kind of interesting here is as they go through these plagues, there's a series of like magicians that live with the Pharaoh, and as these plagues are being inflicted, Pharaoh's magicians are kind of doing the same thing to sort of prove like it's not really a God thing. So it's like, oh, you can turn that to blood, so can I. Oh, you can do these frogs, so can I. Da, 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 da. So it gets down to, I think it's the boils maybe, or the livestock death, I can't remember, I should have written it in here, where they can no longer replicate. And so all of a sudden he's like, okay, maybe this is something more than just a magician impacting the situation. The other thing with these is all this 4 through 8, these are causing utter destruction, right? You've got flies just infesting everything, boils all over your skin, hail crushing all of the crops, like killing slaves, killing people, killing your livestock, if you had anything that was still alive from livestock death. and then locust eating everything. So this is just like wiping out what their world is looking like. Then we get down to darkness, so completely dark for 3 days. Definitely harkens back to Genesis 1, 2, of God creating the light. And then we get to the last one, and on all of these, I should be saying, in all of these, as the plague is happening, the Egyptians are very upset about it, obviously, and they're like, come on, like, just let the people go, let the people go. And Pharaoh says towards the end of each plague, fine, you can like make this stop, and then I'll let the people go. And Moses asks God to make it stop, and then Pharaoh's like, nope, just kidding. And then we go in this cycle where it's like 9 times of the plague happens. The people are pressuring Pharaoh to basically let the Israelites go. Pharaoh sort of agrees with like his fingers crossed behind his back, and then it repeats 9 times. So we come down to the 10th plague, which is the death of all firstborn. And the exclusion here for the Israelites is that if you will be spared if you give a sacrifice to either a lamb, and then mark your door frame with the blood and stay inside to avoid that judgment. So the kind of death rolls through the land. Those who have done the steps avoid judgment, and then this is the final straw. Pharaoh is distraught, he's terrified, and he agrees to let the Israelites go. And I think, I know most of these like lasted for 7 days. I think the darkness was 3 days, but I believe most of these lasted for 7 days, which is a very symbolic, complete number in the Bible. So I went through those kind of quickly, but what I did want to do is pop up that symbolism that I was talking about. So with the frogs, inverted taming chaos. Chaos was separating the water from the land. Gnats from dust, the inverted decreation part of that is humans from dust. This is now gnats from dust. The plagues, all causing utter destruction, is an inversion of the creation story. This is a decreation story. In darkness, inverted of day 1, let there be light. And then, not quite inverted, but we've got the nod to the fact that Israelite baby boys were drowned, and now we've got basically the Egyptian firstborn were killed. And then a parallel where it's stay inside, avoid judgment while this death happens is a harken back to Noah's Ark, where it's get in the ark, stay until you have a sign that everything has been cleared. So finally, in the very bottom here, Pharaoh lets the Israelites leave, and the first Passover feast is observed. I didn't think I was going to have time to do the Passover feast, so I didn't put a slide on it. We've got a couple minutes left. But this was mainly what I wanted to cover. Hi, Charlie. You've got your hand up.
Yeah, just one thing I want to do, but in the spirit of the symphony of Scripture,
Yep.
in the spirit of what we're doing today in worship, with the story from Matthew about the Magi in Matthew chapter 2, if you keep reading in Matthew chapter 2, Herod got infuriated that he had been tricked by the wise men. So guess what Herod decides to do? Take a book out of Pharaoh's playbook and kill all the baby boys, which is why the Holy Family fled. The Sunday after Christmas, not this Sunday, but last Sunday, is traditionally, in some church circles, the Feast of the Holy Innocents. The lectionary reading is that day. Most people, I don't think I've ever preached on that, because most people don't want to come to church and hear about rulers killing babies, but again, it's one of those the realities of our Scripture, and you can draw plenty of parallels with the world about the human suffering and stuff. So as we're thinking about the wise men, singing the songs and all that, we need to remember that the reality of the brutality in the world of people in power misusing it, and how God's calling us to be light and hope in those situations.
Thanks. Yes?
I'm a visitor, so take it for what it's worth, but I'm very, this book is a fascinating story. It's got incredible human personalities, both positive and negative. But I really do need this, and I consider myself a Christian. I want to believe it as a story.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot believe that God would wave his hand and produce these magical tragedies. Because if that is the God we believe in, then I'm troubled.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. John, great segue to you.
Big segue. I look at it somewhat the same way. So let's talk about, like, when was this book written? The book was compiled, scholars most likely say, in the 6th century BCE. So what happened in the 6th century? Well, that's when the elite of Judah were in Babylon. The Babylonians had captured the kingdom of Judah and took all the elite, anybody who could read and write, and others over into Babylon. Over in Babylon, they wanted freedom. They wanted liberation. So this is a story written in that time, a liberation story. That's exactly what it started out with. And as it was mentioned, Charlie mentioned it. And certainly the slaves in the U.S. in the last 19th century, they understood it that way. Go Down Moses, a great spiritual, and other sorts of spirituals. They got the story right. It's a liberation story. So, yes, then because they were writing it then, this is also when many of the other books of the Bible sort of got written down. The people who wrote this knew the Genesis stories, and so they could make these connections. Now, as far as history, for example, if you talk to Egyptologists, they have a great sense of, they know the history of Egypt. And there is no time in Egypt when the situation in Exodus even is similar at all. The cities in Egypt were not built by slaves. Apparently, they were built by Egyptians, paid by the Pharaoh with bread and wine and things like that. So, and then also another interesting thing, in the Bible, there's several references to particular pharaohs doing historical things. The Pharaoh who sacked Jerusalem was called Pharaoh, suddenly the name slipped, but he started with S. But, and then another Pharaoh killed King Josiah. His name is given, Pharaoh Necho. This Pharaoh is Pharaoh, right? It's as if I was writing, hey, here's a story in American history. The president did this, the president did that, the president did this. And you say, which president, Trump or George Washington? And I'd ignore your question and keep talking about the president. You would soon suspect that I was just making this all up, all right? And that's sort of what this is. I mean, which Pharaoh? And they knew Pharaoh's names. Also, they picked the Egyptians as their heavies because when you're in Babylon, you can hardly write a story where God is picking on the Babylonians. The Babylonians won't like that. So they picked the Egyptians. And again, in Israel and Judah, they were independent countries only because the big boys left them alone. The big boys being Egypt and the Mesopotamian powers, Assyria and Babylon. So they picked Egypt. And they always knew that their freedom, their independence would be gone when the big boys decided to play. And around the year 1000 BCE, the Egyptians, okay, first of all, the Egyptians controlled Palestine for thousands of years in the great heyday of the Egyptian Empire. Around 1000, Egypt had internal problems, civil wars. There were, at one point, I think there might have been 5 different pharaohs, each with their little turf. So they pulled their troops and authority out of Palestine, and that allowed King David, this chieftain, this marauder or mercenary leader, to set up a kingdom. And their kingdom was established only because Egypt didn't mess with them. And so they always knew, that they were dependent on that. Now, that's different than the mentality of us in the United States. We got our freedom because we got our freedom, and nobody else can take it, And we're the top of the heap. And Israel and Judah knew they were well down on the heap, okay? So, but then they needed a liberation story when they were in Babylon. And they came up with this one. and it's a great story. But as you say, you find some of the theology questionable, and I do too. But that's the way they saw it, and they were oppressed, and they needed freedom. Okay, any questions that I missed? Michael?
I've always thought of the plagues in this different way, could be wrong, but it's when I think about free will versus predetermination, that if God is all-knowing, he knows what we'll choose, he knows we will make mistakes, but redemption is offered to Pharaoh over and over again, and God knows he won't choose it, but
Right.
he's still going to give him the choice.
Yes.
He's not just going to say, I know your heart, so I'm going to wipe you out and set my people free. He says over and over again, here's your chance to free your people.
Yeah.
And so that, to me, is trying to tell us something different outside of the plagues. It's about this idea that we can choose the wrong thing and choose the wrong thing, and another opportunity will be there for redemption for us.
Yeah, yes, I think that's right about the interplay of free will and God. And these people back then, they were sophisticated. A long time ago, but they weren't stupid. They were sophisticated, and they knew that the way that God interacts with us is not simple, we must do what he says, we have our choice, but we also are manipulated in some way. Yes?
Yeah, I really appreciated that comment, because that really came through in reading it to me, that over and over and over, this slimy Pharaoh gets another chance from God. I think that was a big point. But then the other thing that was sort of interesting that I had not seen in the past was that, for many of these plagues, God says, I will make a distinction between my people and the Egyptians, right? So these things only affect the Egyptians until the last plague, where he also gives the Israelites a choice. And he says, now you need to decide who you're going to identify with, who you're going to follow, because if you don't choose to follow me, you'll be classed with the Egyptians and suffer the same penalty as they did. So I thought that was sort of an interesting thing, because at the very end, everyone needs to choose in this story.
Okay, yeah, so we got to close up here, and that's a very good point that you've made. I want to also say that when I said they wrote the story, they didn't make it up whole cloth in the 6th century BCE. They had stories from the past that they combined and so forth. There was a lawgiver, Moses, from the ancient past that we're not sure of. And again, they took different traditions. So I think my point of view is there's a tradition that said Mount Sinai is the holy mountain, and there's another tradition that said Mount Horeb is the holy mountain. And they're different places, and I say they just took both of them because both were part of their sacred religious heritage. And that's fine. So, okay. Well, thank you for your questions. I guess we're pretty much out of time.
I got one more thing to think, one more thing to ponder. All right, so now put yourself in the position of the Pharaoh. What are you holding on to, despite the clear signs that you need to let it go? All right.
Size medium shirts.
All right, thanks, everyone.